Thanks, Qtron man, and I really appreciate what you're saying because this is a large part of what I'm trying to do with relativistic skepticism, and I think I did describe it a little bit in those last videos. This aspect of compatibility, and it works on a principle of functional equivalence. You know, like if it walks like a duck and talks like a duck, it is a duck. That's not what it is, but it's similar. It's more like if it walks like a duck and talks like a duck, then it works in place of a duck. So it's not actually the same thing, two different descriptions of a duck, but they both fit in the grammatical position of a duck, right? So what it really means is if they're really equivalent, like usually there's at least slight differences, you know, because you can also say, well, I prefer one over the other. There's a difference. It feels different. But you know, if they're pretty strictly functionally equivalent in the agreed upon metrics for measuring their equivalency, then it means it doesn't matter. You can have yours, I can have mine, be based on my personal, you know, individual preferences. And that's individual sovereignty, that's individuality. And you can't even say, no, you have to use Occam's razor and find the most simple one, or et cetera, because ultimately you can't insist to an individual, you know, what criteria they'll use for such a thing. But you can agree with someone else that they're pretty much functionally equivalent. Now, as opposite as skepticism is from an objectivism, big O or little o, they can be equivalent if the objectivist admits that they are not omnipotent. They can't get 100% knowledge. So the skeptic says there's always more questions in an inquiry. And the dogmatist said, no, ultimately there can be an answer. But if the dogmatist agrees that they'll never actually get all the answers, even in one subject matter, then the skeptic can agree that you get close enough. You can eliminate so many variables in a small domain where you're limiting that you can get arbitrarily close to certain knowledge. And there's a funny thing about probabilities is that you can never make something 100% certain, but it's when you start stretching the nines out, 90.9. 99.9999999%, you could get probabilities that are not likely to happen in the whole life of the universe so far in 13 billion years. So the skeptic can admit that you do approach sometimes things that are very reliable, and you certainly don't need a 99% for it to be reliable. I mean, a 70 or 80% thing is pretty reliable. On the other hand, if someone were to say, well, 1 in 10 times the opposite happens, that would be a reliable statement as well. So there's a compatibility between these two things. And this is one of the goals of skepticism and relativistic skepticism. But I think skepticism in general, because these were people that like studying ideas, including other people's ideas. And that applies to me. And so they have invented the wheel or the hub, out from which spokes can go to the different elements of the wheel. And granted, I think we need different elements of the wheel. And here's where I will start to differ from, I have a compatibility with other philosophies, even dogmatic ones. But where it becomes incompatible is, I value other philosophies that you still would consider your opposite, because they're out on the spoke of the wheel on the opposite side. So, you might get in trouble from objectivist friends who sense, because, Rand, obviously very good objectivist, she had a sense for these kinds of things. Like she's one of the few objectivists that I think really correctly identified just how dangerous the idea of libertarianism is to Rand, because Rand wasn't liberal in that sense either. So there's a danger that I am, too libertarian. But there is a compatibility. I think the important part is that, as a relativist, I would like to believe that, of course, we're all going to be different. We're going to be that opposite forever. We're going to have different opinions, and we have to figure out a way to come to consensus or agree to disagree and still do some action, like by majority rule, or I like supermajority rule, that it takes 2/3 or 5/6 of the people to agree before you do something. That would train us to agree a lot more. Agreeing at 51% creates schizophrenia. But anyway, that's another matter. Whereas other philosophies have more of the goal of, no, everybody should think in this particular school of philosophy. Now, objectivism, one of the redeemable things about it and libertarianism, because it can be classified together from outside, is that there's a reliance on it's like, even though you go, well, people are nuts, you still have this principle of objectivism of, yeah, and they have a right to be nuts. They just don't have the right to cost me in certain ways. But, they have the right to still be communist and go make their own little communist thing if everybody really agrees or whatever. Most people that think it through, agree on this kind of thing as long as there's voluntary. Of course, there's a trick there, as an aside, that some philosophies are inherently non-voluntary. It's like, we're going to do this to you against your will. And those, on the one hand, have to be excluded, yet on the other hand, we have to admit that the criminal is going to have their will violated because they broke some rule. So, how do you, it's hard fundamentally to define those, even though you know it when you see it, kind of thing. But anyway, so there is a compatibility, and I think the compatibility is important, that even in principle, I think there's value in those that might say, hey, don't fall for this compatibilism with this skeptic, because it takes you, it's just a junction into totally opposite things. That's true. But for somebody that's strong-willed and can come to this junction, see the way to the other things and go, I'm not going that way, it's a powerful thing, because in the real world, I want to take your ideas into account in my politics, and I want you to take mine into account. I want it to affect you, not necessarily change you to my view, but enough that we can say, yeah, let's build this road. You can say, well, I don't believe in tax money, but if we're going to do the tax money, yeah, let's spend it on that rather than this. And I can say, well, I believe in taxes, but okay, let's reduce them because I can see, the sense in that, or even let's eliminate them or do it a different way, because I'm just for the infrastructure organization, infrastructural state, to have some way to fund itself. Because, the alternate to taxes is that, well, what if it just has a car company, makes money? It has companies. Whenever there's a commodity, it gets registered as a commodity, and a government company starts up to try to make money, that narrow margin. Because when you get something as a commodity, it's down pat. Industry has got it down pat. The government can just take that knowledge that was developed by industry. It's almost like industry has finished its work. Now that's pretty communist. So you might prefer taxes to that. That might be the compromise for the long term. But we can still agree on what we do with the taxes, and as I say, we can discuss other ways to make revenue. But you can also just charge for the governmental services, just the people that use them. But that I don't know about. That has to be where the individual citizen is protected. I don't like them getting locked in with fees. But I can imagine, we protect against piracy at sea, though not as well as we should. You could charge for that. And, I'm for even a market of sorts on those things, except for the fact that there has to be someone to police the market. But anyway, okay, now we've expanded, but I think it's a very interesting subject. I'd like to discuss all of it, including the dangers, the risks involved, but also with agreeing with someone that potentially is your opposite. But as I've said before to all the objectivists and market anarchists and libertarians, I consider myself a kind of libertarian. I call it a progressive libertarian, so as to give full disclosure of that some of my conclusions are considered liberal. But really it comes from a belief in personal liberty. So I am in that school, and we just disagree what really the practicalities are, how the principles work. I think there's some ironic things where you might do something that seems like it won't have the effect that you hope, but there's sort of sometimes homeopathy works. You do something, you give somebody a virus, and that's it's a kind of a neutered down virus, and it's a vaccine. Sometimes there's things like this that lead to disagreements. But and then the other thing is that, and you've seen this in me, and just to finish up, but I appreciate that you overlooked that, Rand kind of bothers me, like her books and stuff, so sometimes it just is a pet peeve. But in terms of that whole school of philosophies she partook in, though I have some serious criticisms that can be taken personally, overall, I like pursuing political philosophy as a means to achieve an invention of individual sovereignty.